All right, so I'll get going. I'm Rich Levesque. I'm from Dymax. Can't see where everyone's from, but I'm going to start with some basics just to bring everyone up to speed on what we are, what our products, technologies are, and then jump into the new technologies that we're bringing forward now. So a little about Dymax, family-owned company. We're global. We've got 11 locations throughout the globe, and we've got a rundown here of our employees. Headquartered in Torrington still and growing faster and faster. We're opening up new locations now as we speak. We'll soon have presence in Mexico as well. A little rundown of the map. Most of the innovation is actually happening in Connecticut, here in the States. We're starting to also specialize some innovation by bringing some of those efforts to our other locations. So as an example, in some of our Asia teams are specializing in something like our conveyors. So we're going to start specializing certain groups in certain areas based on what they're focused on. Just a quick run through. So those who might be new to the technology, UV curing, how that basically works is you have a stack up of ingredients that all basically work around a photo initiator that's going to kick off the reaction. So when we're putting the adhesive down into its place, it gets fully seated, put in place, because the minute you hit it, it's immediately cured. There's no delay, there's no triggering, light hits it, it begins curing immediately. So this is kind of a rundown of how that happens. You get free radicals that get initiated by those photons. So the energy comes in, breaks things up, and now all those particles can go to work, ultimately ending in polymers that are chained up and terminated. It kind of just goes through a little bit more of that, but ultimately the goal is to match up whatever chemistry we land on for whatever type of application you guys are going on. We've got 10,000 plus formulas. Some of them are adhesives, which is what everyone starts with thinking of, is we're bonding things together. But this also applies to coatings, gaskets, seals, masking agents, temporary placements, things like that. So that all basically falls into the same kind of technology that we're talking about when we talk about UV adhesives. So why Dymax? I mean, this stuff's been around for 30 plus years now. What we do is we really focus on the ins and outs of every little aspect of the application. So we're looking at your substrates. We're looking at the way the light accesses it. What do we have to do to maybe help you with the design to facilitate the light access? Or what do we have to do on our side with giving you the right tools? So we might have different transmissibility. We might have different timing requirements or constraints on your process. We might not only have light access issues, but dispensing access issues. How do we actually get the adhesive there? Because sometimes that's even harder than getting the light there. And once you do get to the dispense portion, how do you control that the right way? How do you get the right amount in the right place? How do you verify it? And once you're there, obviously going into the cure as well. So when you work with Dymax, a lot of times what we'll start with is you'll start with someone who's going to talk to you about, hey, we have this opportunity. You're looking to create an assembly, convert a process, invent something new. And we'll start with looking at, well, give us a rundown of how your application looks. What's the light access look like? How are you preparing the surface? Are you preparing the surface, or should we help you on that as well? And then once we're looking at that bond, the access, how are we dispensing and controlling the volume? How are we controlling things like depth of cure? Are we going too deep in some areas? Are we too broken up in, say, the distribution of the adhesive? Do we have to break it into two dispersions? Do we put a thin coating and a potting? And do we make those different chemistries all together at the same time? So there's a lot to really consider, and that's part of the process when you get going with us, is going through all those little details to make sure that we've got everything lined up perfectly, and then we cure it all once it's in place. And I guess to that point too, there's a lot more to just hitting it with light. We're talking about differences in intensity, energy types, maybe mixing of energies, which is actually one of the things that Dymax is working on now too when you get to LEDs. So you've got all these elements, you think you got a handle on all of them, and then we come in with how do we validate all of that process. When we start doing these things, we have labs that we can do them for you, or ultimately what we end up leading to is let's work with you through validation on your end. Is there aging? Is there life testing? Is there going to be performance, destructive testing on your side as well? So what we like to try and do is before we send you down that path on your own, obviously you guys are validating your own processes, but we can do a little bit of upfront work on our side. We've got applications groups, R&D groups, business development groups, all focused on making sure before we send you down your path resourcing, we do as much as we can up front to make sure we got you on the right foot. And what are some of the tools that we bring that's differentiator for Dymax? We've got some patented technologies that have been really successful and really taken off, and still to this day hold. Some of these patents are going on 5, 6, 7 years old, but they're still very relevant and very strong. So talking through each one a little bit, Secure. A lot of the things that are a challenge when you're making the assembly and going through your process is 2 steps of, usually the questions are, how do I know I've got it where it should be? And then once it's cured, how do I know it's cured and it's still there? So we break all those little features up now. So C-Cure is simply the fact that it's blue when it's wet and it's clear when it's cured, or colorless technically. Some of them aren't really clear. So what that means is we can take this vivid blue and in some instances still use optical inspection without having the fluorescing that everyone's gotten used to over the years. We can actually use optical inspection pre-cure without hitting it with cure energy. We can just look at the blue light with visible light. So we can take a color camera before it's cured, just take a look at it, inspect it without affecting it, without curing it, just by looking at the blue color. It's been very helpful. Beyond that, Encompass. So now we cure it. So this is when you hit it with light. That light now can be almost any flavor of LED. In the beginning, when we got to the LED industry, chemistries weren't really there yet. So you had a broad spectrum requirement on many chemistries. So you may have been using an old chemistry for years and now you want to update the line. Well, now's the opportunity to look at something that's Encompass, which means we can pick your flavor of either existing LED energy on your line or Dymax technology. Typically what we play with is 365 nanometer, 385 nanometer, and 405 nanometer. And with an Encompass product, it won't matter which one. So we can look at the other processes you have in line and maybe blend it so that we're using a multi-purpose wavelength for you. A good example of that could be 365 is also blacklight fluorescing energy. So we could use potentially the same light system at a high intensity to cure your product and then dial it down and use it to inspect it with some fluorescing. So it really opens up the tools and makes things more efficient. And then that goes into the ultra-red fluorescing. Blue fluorescing's been around a long time. We changed the game with red. Now, there's a couple other red fluorescers you'll see on the market. It's very different than ours. Ours is very much formulated and protected into the formulation so that it's much more resistant to bleaching and aging over time bleaching as well. So with a traditional or say competitive other color fluorescing, you hit it with a little too much light, it immediately starts bleaching. So now your cameras are off. If it's an automated system, they might not have the same threshold triggers, whereas our ultra-red stays very stable. So your camera systems that are taught to look for it will stay tuned in for much longer. And in the field, what we've seen is products that have been out for 2 years and then they have like a quality audit or something like that where they're checking 2 years out how our products look that far down the line, the fluorescing's still there, it hasn't faded. So it's very different than just a dye that's added in. It's actually built in the matrix, so it's protected and more robust. So what are the new products we're coming forward with right now? On the chemistry side, we've got an autoclavable 1040M, we're calling it. So this material stands up to what a lot of other adhesives struggle with an autoclave. So you can go through, and the data is right up here, you can go through, bond the assemblies, put it through autoclave, and generally speaking, we're gonna have industry-leading survivability across those processes. So if you're doing sterilization, we definitely start you off with looking at 1040M. And just a little bit of a rundown, when you see the types of cycles that this has been validated against, it's actually very impressive. It's pretty strong and it's hard to break down. Wearables is another big market for us. So we actually have some specific products that are built for this market. So with wearables, we're looking at 2101 MWUR. The wearable is actually built into the name, so it's pretty easy to identify. But we're looking at a lot of those new technologies that I was talking about. So we've got the Encompass, which is LED curable. Specifically, this one we've optimized for 405. And a lot of that has to do with substrates we're working towards. So if we look at Some substrates, glasses, laminates, they're going to block UV. And inherently that becomes a little bit of a curveball with UV curable materials. So that is where 405 comes in. It's in the visible spectrum, it edges over, so now it can get through a lot of UV blocking substrates, so we can still cure it. And this is true with like a lot of the screens or the other wearable components that are going to be inhibitive to the cure. Another thing here is the ingredients. We're talking about skin contact in some cases. Biocompatibility here is very much the forefront of what this product is formulated to be compatible for. And then going further into challenging environments, we have moisture resistant for wearables. It's just a little bit more moisture resistant, has slightly different cured properties. HLC is very new for Dymax, and it's actually somewhat new for the industry. So this is a hybrid light curable chemistry. And what that means is it behaves similar to a cyanoacrylate in the sense that it pulls moisture out of the environment. But it's also UV curable. But it's not a UVCA. We use very different backbone materials in this so that it's actually a little bit more robust. It doesn't craze as much. So if you've ever worked with a cyanoacrylate where it deposits and puts a lot of, let's say, adverse satelliting around the surface or hazing, things like that, this reduces that behavior quite a bit. It has the advantage of being able to carry a cure pretty well. So if you had, say, squeeze out, spill out outside of the bond line, you can still hit it with UV, lock in that assembly, move it on maybe to a staging area, or depending on how your process goes. It's essentially finished for all intents and purposes, but if there is, say, questionable shadowed areas or areas that you're not 100% sure are getting the same intensity as the rest of the assembly, the environmental cure will kick it over and carry it to kind of guarantee that that cure is only going to get better over time. (250-CTH) is a cationic epoxy. So this is actually a branch off of another type of chemical functionality. Cationics do work with a delay. So we can hit the material with the dose of light, and then the catalyst will continue to do their work after the exposure. So you get this ability to maybe put parts together at a delay or look at different flexibility along that automation that you need that delay to build in because you're introducing another step in the process. It's got some other details in terms of shipping and handling, but I'd like to move into the equipment. So the carrying equipment as Dymax has it today is essentially a bit of a layout like this. So we have spot lamps, flood lamps, and conveyors. Like I said before, the LED industry is catching up, and we're going to soon now have the LEDs put into a conveyorized platform. But we've made a lot of headway in terms of spot curing, and I'll go into some of the new stuff in the next few slides. Flood curing, we've gone from the old kind of easy bake ovens, we'd call them, where you have this big bulb light that creates a lot of heat. It's got to be on all the time. Now with LEDs, we can go to smart handling and usage programmability. So you're pulsing them rather than keeping them on the whole time. It's not a space heater in your line. You've got to work to exhaust. Huge advancements going to LED. I'm sure you guys are already familiar with those. So one of the new, more modular approaches to the way we're doing some of our LEDs is instead of having a controller and a dedicated emitter, we're getting smarter at how we build our controllers so that we can plug almost any of our emitters into them now. So we're really reducing and getting smarter with the amount of control interfaces we do. And with the MX series, we have exactly that here, focusing on the emitter construction. So we have the controller that sits on a bench or under a table, and I'll show you now our new DIN railable one. But with these emitters, you have these small formats, and these are out on our bench, so you can take a look at them. They're set up and running. But you have a spot cure. So we talked about that chart of cure formats. With the MXs, we're starting to blend those now, so that we actually have a spot capability out of a LED emitter that could either be swapped out in terms of the emitter format for a small flood or a linear flood. This could also plug in a light guide. So let's say you can get this only so close to your line. You can get it very close, but then you maybe, say, have movement and robotic swinging of those things. You can still implement a light guide like our old light in a box units used to have. So we have, with just the swap of the emitter head now, ability to go to a spot point, spot point with light guide, even splitting that light guide. And then we also have a 2x2 flood, and then a little line emitter, 2-inch line emitter. So it focuses the energy that was dispersed around the 2-inch square into a very thin line that's conveniently the size of a lot of connectors, Y ports, fittings. It's perfect size to put any of those little components right under it and focus all of its light onto it. It's become a very helpful tool for us. So as I said, we started to now focus on integration, simplification of controls, a little bit more efficiency there. One of the things we came up with was what we call our MIM, our Machine Interface Module. So this is where we're working with folks like ATS. All the control units that you see in terms of like a UV emitter, they tend to have, I'm going to skip around a little bit, a user interface like this box here on the left, where you have this unit with all these controls, and then all that was really doing was for us at the bench level to sit there and interact with it, for a user to touch it. But once you're really in production mode, there's no user touching that thing. It's all industrial controls at that point. So what did we do? We figured out that a lot of the interfaces and new technologies are using either the Ethernet IP or Profinet protocols. So, and also wanting to free up some real estate on the bench. So we made a unit that clicks right onto the DIN rail. Basically, you feed it from the same power supplies you're feeding the rest of your controls. And now you have a unit that tucks away in the cabinet. You connect your emitters to, run the cables out, and now the emitters are localized to the point of use, and the controller is just in the cabinet with everything else. So it's not always a very impactful message for the end users, because we all just probably worked with the benchtop unit until we developed the process. And then we hand it over to someone like ATS. This is where they really see this as a value, because they can free up a lot of your machine real estate if they're building a line for you, and they can consolidate a lot of controls. And then the big key is this makes it a smart control unit on their system. They can now go in and see this as a device on their network and have full control over it like they do everything else. It's been a huge innovation for us, and again, I have one sitting on the bench at our table out here, and you can go take a look at it. And once you're in there, the other big gains you're going to get out of just the simplification of controls is actually the data you're getting out of it. So this thing has full onboard diagnostics. It's got a built-in web tool. You put in the IP address, you can pull up the browser and go through every nut and bolt in this thing. You get constant temperature readouts, you get diagnostics, code readouts, and not having to do any of the wiring for I/O, because it's all Ethernet over IP. So it's all through a network connection. It's the way to go. And even if you're at a point where, I've worked with a couple customers where, we're not really doing a fully high-speed automated line, we're still on the bench. If you have a laptop, then that still might be enough to consider this as a better controller, because this is actually giving you more information than our standard controllers do. I can't give you, while you're running, all of your controller temperature and emitter temperatures separately. I can't give you full logging of all your error codes. I can't give you any of that with our standard touchscreen controllers. So this is actually just a more smart, more in-depth analytical look at your process from both the controller side and into an individual emitter. So worlds away of where we were. And then in terms of safety, we've upgraded all of the safety controls on this. So it has dedicated hard interlocks. It's not software driven, it's actually hardware driven interlocks. So it's a step ahead in terms of safety as well. And also you'll notice it's terminal block driven. All this is standard terminal blocks, nothing proprietary. It's all easy stuff for an integrator machine builder to work with. And then along with the MX platform, I was talking about getting smarter with our controllers and less proprietary dedicated controllers. We came out with a unit called the QX4 some years ago. It's another wand device unit, and the differentiator there is it has focal lenses at the tip. So they're little focused lenses that you have to choose from, so you can change the way the aperture focuses the light. We wanted to why not take that unit, and with the power that it requires at each wand, why not consolidate to our MX platform? So then we can start playing with things like the MIM, and just being much easier for people who know Dymax product. Oh, I got to learn a QX4 controller, I got to learn an MX controller. Now if we can just get everyone on an MX platform, it's just much easier for people to come in and out of using our stuff. So what the 4E expansion is doing is taking this extra module and allowing you to plug that into the MX, and now you have an intermediary for the QX wands. So now you can control up to 16 of those wands by using the MX 4E controller. So it's basically about distribution of power. Because those QX4s, the little wands, pull less power, we can power more of them. So you can get 16 little outputs. So depending on what you need for intensity threshold, we can potentially hit many more points with the QX4 wands versus the MX. And the other big gain you have there is you don't have those emitter boxes at the end of the lines either. So now you maybe don't have the room, or you don't want those extra emitter boxes, or you don't want the heat, or maybe it's a clean room requirement. We can take these little wands, run them much farther and much more of them without the emitter having to travel with it, because it's actually a little micro emitter in that tiny wand. So it's much better in terms of that. Another great technology that we're coming on board with, this is just releasing, we call it the AccuTrack. It's a closed loop sensor. So traditionally in UV processes, what you're usually doing is monitoring everything through regular checks with a radiometer. So if it's a conveyorized line, maybe you're sending a puck through. If it's a point cure system, you're coming in with wands with a radiometer and measuring each of those little outputs, usually at shift startup or maybe every 1,000 parts. Well, now you can take all of that process monitoring that's user-based and integrate a track sensor in it. So now this thing is constantly monitoring. It gets installed, so this little end piece is either installed just at the end of our cure, very close to the emitter end itself, and that gets honed in as to where the sensitivity needs to be. Or we can put it into an enclosure. If you have a certain particular part of your enclosure or your line that is sensitive and that needs to make sure it sees a certain amount, we can mount it more closely to that key point. And the primary functionality isn't just that it's monitoring it, it's adjusting our units with it. So if there's a fade, if there's a change in conditions, even if it's something as mundane that is a maintenance point, like cleaning your emitter optics. It's very common for emitter optics in the industrial atmospheres to get clouded, pick up dust, or maybe it's byproduct of the adhesive curing, and that has to be maintained to keep the intensity at its peak levels. Well, while it's not a perfect solution for you're still going to eventually have to clean your emitters, this will at least make sure that while the line's running, it didn't have an adverse effect, because it can make those adjustments. And it runs at about a 5% tolerance. In the UV curing world, we find that to be perfectly acceptable. But this now will hook in, and we're spreading it across the whole LED portfolio over time. We're going to be releasing it focused on things like the MX and the floods, but it'll go into the conveyors. So just now everything will just become inherently smarter and self-monitoring of intensity. And a differentiator just worth mentioning, there's been other closed loop monitoring systems on the market. A lot of them are looking at just light as a whole. And what I mean by that is potentially light that's not even relevant to your process. A lot of like broad spectrum cures or even LED cures that are mismatched wavelengths, they're going to give you this radiometry reading or energy feedback reading that might say we're seeing all this energy, but really you're looking for one piece of that that's actually for your process, and that's what the AccuTrack is targeting. It's the actual usable energy for your process that's coming out of our unit. I won't read through these slides, obviously. There's a lot of text in you for read, but essentially reiterating what I had just explained. So how do we set it up? As I mentioned, depends on the application. Depends on which unit we're going to be monitoring. But it can be literally as close and out of the rest of your process as right next to emitter. So we're not asking for another piece of installation necessarily. This just simply means we can tag this little sensor right up to the emitter and get it very close, and we'll figure out the sensitivities based on that. Yes, sir?
Is it a separate cycle to check the intensity, or is it run actually within the cycle of the machine?
Yeah, so the question was, is it a separate check that you have to run or a separate process, or is it automatic? It's integrated and automatic. So once you have the AccuTrack set up and established, it's running on its own.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Just a little bit more of a detail on how it runs. and the types of data that it's looking at. So when you're looking at our MX controllers, these are the fields that it's pulling from. This is a trigger value, so you can actually set what triggers you run and have multiple triggers that trigger one or more different emitters. And then you have your power and your time. And then this is your readout for the matching of the AccuTrack. So you actually get a piece of data behind it as well. It's not just a blind process, it actually gives you the data for it. And systems integration. So this is something new I'll talk about for Dymax. Kind of started dabbling in this maybe, I want to say it was a little over 6-7 years ago. What we started realizing with our customers was we get a lot of customers that know us for our chemistry, and they know us for our lights, and they start working with our folks and saying, all right, we've got the adhesive figured out, we've got the curing figured out, we even have a little bit of the dispensing picture, we think we know how we're getting the adhesive in there, but we don't have the in-house resources, we don't really have a great machine builder relationship, or the machine builders we work with see this as peanuts and it's just not big enough for them. I'll use ATS as an example. If you're asking ATS to build you a machine that's going to make you 400 parts a month, they're going to ask, like, well, are these things, by parts, do you mean cars? Like, do you mean something huge? 400 of a little bonded assembly is not even within their scale of what they want to play with. So Dymax started to see all these little gaps in what was commercially available in terms of integration and automation services, as well as simple process development. And a lot of our customers had nowhere to go, or we felt like we saw projects stuttering and failing to take off because they weren't getting that integration support that they needed. So we got a team of guys together and started saying, why don't we try this ourselves? Let's see what we can do for you guys. And a lot of it was very much specialized in exactly our stuff. A lot of integrators and machine builders aren't specialized the way we are in UV. That's a big one. So like an ATS might come to us and say, you know, we do a lot of this, but we're really nervous about enclosing your UV light properly. That's kind of out of our specialty. Fine, we'll take that. So tell us your architecture, give us the line requirements, we'll create a subassembly, and you might be a shared customer between us and ATS. That's great, that's fine. We'll take that little subassembly, we'll focus on maybe incorporating the dispense, a little bit of assembly steps, and then the cure, and we'll make sure that the dispense is managed exactly the way it should be for our chemistries, the cure is managed the right way, and we're the UV experts, we'll make sure this thing is 100% UV safe. So we started going down that path and got a lot of traction very quickly. So now we're going full to market with it and saying, we can pretty much help you figure out, let's say you're converting from two-part epoxy, or let's say you're starting a completely new line, and I thought the keynote today was perfect on that. A lot of times we're developing the solution to manufacture at the same time you're developing the product. And it's hard to get forward on a huge integrated line when you don't know where the next two steps might land based on your design change. So again, that's where we come to play because we're much more faster to react and specialized on those bonds that are developing as the product develops. So we can take those little jobs and keep things moving quickly. So that could look like a few different things. You could come at us and say, you know, we love your conveyor systems and lights and settings, but it's not going to play well with the onboard and offboard operations of that conveyance system. You might say, well, we've got a loader that needs this, or we're on these carriers that can't come off the carrier line. Okay, we'll kit up something that's going to house around the existing line, or we'll come up with tooling that's going to make it easier and more modular coming in and out. So it could even actually also be as simple as, we love all of your solution, but we just don't have the time or people to set it up when we get it. We can do that now as well. So it can be us kitting it, and actually we just did this last week, or 2 weeks ago, where a customer they're setting up a dispensing line where they have 18 valves. So you got to manifold these 18 valves. You're running off of a pail pump. None of those guys have experience with pail pumps. They didn't want anything other than, can you just assemble it for us? And then make sure that it works for us. So we went to town on that. We got the pump going, manifolded out these lines, primed it all, set up. Essentially, we treated it like an FAT. Before we shipped just this basic dispensing system, the customer just felt so much better knowing that before we shipped it, we took this whole thing, primed it, got all the air out of the lines, got it all dispensing, got it on a bench, dialed in their 0.0001 milliliter shots repeatedly on the bench. We're good, had a nice little video conference with them. Great, pack it up, put it in the box, we can ship it wet because it's all UV. No UV is gonna cure any of that stuff. So we can just seal up the ends of everything, send it in there, and when you get it back at your place, you plug it in, fire it up, and you're already dispensing. Everything's primed and running out of the box. We found that to be a huge hit with a lot of customers getting going with dispensing for the first time. Some examples of little small projects we've done. It's as simple as some of our filling systems, they needed a change. Well, you guys have a pressure capability that's outside of our safety range for our facility. Okay, we'll find a new hydraulic pump, bring down the powers on it. Now you don't have the safety concern. Custom curing station assemblies, as I mentioned before. Existing line that was running at a high pace, and these folks were all focused on all the other parts of the assembly and robotics and programming. They called us and said, guys, can you just make us the curing assembly? Great. Great little project. Tell us how you want it. Give us your drawings for the installation. We'll make sure it plugs right into your installation. Ready to go. Little other things, and this was kind of my point. These little small odd jobs that are no bids for big companies, automation, machine builders that are specialized in it. Dymax is not focused on it the way we are adhesives, chemistries, and curing. We have this small little skunkworks team that's for this reason, to pick up the pieces and fill in these little gaps, these little things that we often find to be the stumbling blocks of projects. And out of these little projects, we've come up with things that we found really stuck, and there's a lot more use for in the market, so we're going to commercialize. Some of those things look like a simple inspection station. So inspections, this actually started at a trade show. Customer was talking to me, a longtime customer. He's like, you know, Rich, we've been working on your parts for so long, but our operators are sick of this. You know, you just got that sore neck looking at these tiny micro assemblies. We've seen some like inspection scopes, but they don't do this. We've got to go from our curing station to our inspection station, and then things happen. Let's just combine the two. So we took a little heads-up display. We've got a smart camera. We've got 2 of our MX emitters, and those emitters can be set up so that they're a cure at one intensity and they're inspection at another. So depending on the trigger you give the unit, your operator's either doing the cure or doing the inspection. And beyond that, this becomes modular very easily. Depending on the camera we use, it's either an operator inspection where they're actually making the judgment call based on what they see on the screen, or we put a smart camera in there, and it's just screens there to aid the operator in introducing the parts. They might be doing a couple supporting operations, but ultimately when they're done, they hit the camera trigger and the camera tells them whether it's good or not. It's all within the platform of these inspection stations. So we've been making a lot of these at the custom basis. We're gonna hit them into our catalog next year and make some standard offerings. Tube bonding. So again, short of full automation, there's a lot of tube sets and medical assemblies that are just inevitably, to this day, still made by hand. So we see a lot of operations where you got a group of guys or ladies at a bench to the tune of a dozen folks all next to each other doing the same thing. And it's all about taking these little tube assemblies, getting them into their ports, and getting the right amount of adhesive on there. The first thing that you need to do to make sure those guys are all making the same part is putting the same amount of adhesive. So we found that to be the first thing to go after with those problems is just make a little benchtop assembly machine that frees up the operator to never touch the adhesive themselves. They're not touching syringes anymore. They're not judgmentally getting in there. They're not wiping away extra. There's none of that anymore. They take their tube, they put it in the hole. This thing sees the tube, automatically triggers with a rotor dispense, and there's 2 points come around, put a perfect 360-degree dispense around the end of the tube, and every operator's got the same amount of adhesive on every tube. It's been huge in controlling that variation, just that point alone. It has a lot of flexibility and differentiators. There's a couple other tube dispensers we've seen on the market. They're all built around the viscosity of the material. What they ultimately do, some of the competitive units, is you put your tube in the hole and it puts a drop at the top, and then you need the viscosity to allow it to wick to the bottom, and then it's time dependent and it's very viscosity sensitive. With this, we go the opposite route. We actually prefer some body in the adhesive. We prefer a little bit of thixotropy, because when we put that donut of adhesive around, it stays. It doesn't flow, doesn't wick, doesn't go anywhere, and it's very easy to dial in. So we can go in, take a material, like maybe you guys were using some 100 centipoise viscosity that was very runny and hard to track, and it would leak out of the bond. trap bubbles. We add a couple thousand centipoise to the formula, work with something slightly thicker. Now that tube, as they take it out of the machine, the door's open so it doesn't wipe it off. And you could even have a conversation in between, that adhesive staying on the tip where you put it. So these machines, we're calling them the Rotospense 360. It is still a little bit consultative on the front end to make sure we're hitting you with everything we want to run your product the right way. When you start with us, we can do a couple things. We can either take your parts and just set it up, send us your tubes, we'll dial it in, we'll get the adhesive going with it, and we can even start making assemblies for you just to show you it works and take it from there. Or we've got some online questionnaire tools. If you don't want to talk to any of us, you can fill in a couple points of data in a form. It comes right to my team's spreadsheet, and we'll call you instead. And again, this is a platform that'll hit our catalog early next year. And on the large side, one of our big, and this might be a little out of market for you guys, but just so you know, we do a lot in aerospace and defense, and a lot with large parts that are hard to handle. Think about turbines, jet engine components, things like that, or even orthopedic implants, large pieces of bone or portions of the body that are prosthetic, where we need to get some of our surface materials onto the surface. Think speed mask. So you're surface treating a turbine, and portions of that don't want to see the surface stripping, so we need to hit it with our masking materials. How do you get these 3D geometries that are very complex? Unfortunately, we can't show you a lot of those because they're so heavily NDA'd, but we've come up with walk-in cells where we integrate a family of robotic arms that come in. In this case, we go with a cart-based platform where we have these carts that sit into the cell, and they have a platform pedestal that rotates, and those carts can now go all over the shop. So what we found was there was a big holdup in transferring parts from process to process. So we came up with a common cart platform that now those carts are essentially become a fleet in the facility. They get loaded up with a part, and that walks with the part throughout. And they click right in and dock into our station so that every time it needs to come back to a Dimax step, it just bolts in, clicks in, close the door, go to your HMI, pick the process you're going to run. Everything's self-contained. We deliver literally modular. The setup's very easy. You see the eye hooks right on the roof. We come in, drop it in place, plumb it up, power it up, installations a day. It's been a huge success for us. And this applies to, like I said, this came born from parts that there aren't standard ways to handle. They're geometrically challenging. There's no safe place to touch. We got one little place to pick from them, or they're just so big and heavy that they can't be used by an operator, or even robotic challenges come into play. And so these platforms, we split. We have a wet and then the cure. So we're spraying in one, curing in the other. And this platform is flexible enough to handle, like I said, any parts that you have challenging geometries where you're trying to figure out how to get adhesive on all the surfaces. So we've got a lot of tools that connect with us. I just threw this in here because I know this is going to get distributed. You guys, as attendees, should get all of our presentations on a stick. So with that, you'll be able to get into a lot of these links and connect with us that way. That really covers everything that I wanted to show you guys in terms of Dimax's new technologies. Is there any questions? Good. Well, thank you very much for your time, everybody.